Okay, hello and welcome to my first update on my Worm deck. And I still haven't played the deck in real life yet. I'm still waiting for the cards to come home. But I have been goldfishing a ton on Moxfield. And that has given me a lot of new insights. And basically, the main two takeaways are that the deck, somewhat surprisingly, I guess, can easily get a very large hand size uh, on early turns like turn 4, turn 5, turn 6. Get like 10 to 15 to 20 cards in hand. But the deck has trouble capitalizing off this. So often you just end up discarding a bunch and down to 7, and you can't really. It has a hard time closing out the game, even with like this giant hand size. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about cards that I have cut after playing with them. Um, And the first one here, Genesis Storm, this is one of the polymorph cards, and so it's a really tough cut, but it just ended up not fitting into the deck because it flips into non-land permanents, and while we don't really have a lot of artifacts, we do play a pretty big number of enchantments. So and not all of them being particularly high value to flip into. So, and then the clause about copying it each time we cast our commander, that came up almost never because we don't actually cast our commander very often, at least not from the data I've gathered in goldfishing. So it kind of just ended up being not worth it. And then also the sacrifice a creature or deal damage to a single target equal to some creature's power. The third, Fling, Soulfire, and Soul Blast all were just very bad. So there's no real reason to run these over just normal removal spells. And even though they have the chance of knocking one opponent out if you make a really big Thromark and throw it into their face, you still need to deal with 2 other people, and you have just committed a ton of value to knocking one player out. So they're just bad in almost all stages of the game except the ultra late game. And then Traverse Outlands was a really good card, but unfortunately we're not really playing a lot of basics, so we cannot utilize it. If we were playing a lot of basics, then this would be a very premium card, but since we are playing Field of the Dead and we want a lot of different land names, unique land names, we just can't really run a lot of basics. I think we run around 6 to 8 basics right now, so not enough. Altar of Dementia has the same kind of downside as Third Fling, Soulfire, and Soul Blast, in that the payoff is just not really good enough. And yeah, the only way to really win a game with it is if you knock a mill player out with your commander, because none of the other creatures in the deck are big enough to mill somebody out. Feed the Pack is just a bit too slow. Flame Shadow Conjuring and Molten Echoes are fun, but since the creature get exiled, it just ended up not really being like, essentially it's not really worth it to just randomly deal 15 to a player because you copied your World Spine Worm and attacked with it with haste, or you flung it into someone's face. Like, dealing 15 is it's a long way away from 40. So while it might kill someone in the end game, in the early game, you just spend a card doing essentially nothing. And then Metamorphosis also. This is still something I could consider running, but essentially it's really good with Worldspine Worm and some of the other higher cost polymorph payoffs, but oftentimes you don't necessarily want to sacrifice it outright. And at the times, it's a card that is like, it's really good in the late game where you have a ton of cards in hand, and maybe I'll still play it, but for now it's a bit too niche. When you polymorph into your Worldspine Worm, you want a payoff that can get you going further in the game, and that's typically in the form of card draw. And this is something that can get you going if you have some cards in hand that you can play. But the cost is that you have to give up your Worldspine Worm, and yeah, so for now, not really worth it. And Eldritch Evolution just ended up being too gimmicky, and the payoff is not big enough to take up a slot in the deck, basically. And there's some more cards. Rogue's Passage and Skag the Rage Pits are both outclassed by a new utility land addition. And War Room just too slow, and we don't have a lot of space for utility lands in the deck. So each utility land that we play, or each colorless land, I should say, has to do something really relevant, and War Room is just not relevant at all. It's only good in games where we are totally stuck, like flooding out and don't have any cards in our hand, and those games sucks, and War Room is not gonna change those games. Mirren Demonic Well and Witch's Clinic are for these mass life gain, and I don't know if this is relevant, so for now they are not in the deck. And then there's the wheel effects, and these are not really that good because you already have a lot of big draw spells in the deck, a lot of way to draw way more than 7 cards. And in the early game, where you want to rummage and throw cards that you don't want out to draw some more cards, these can also be kind of annoying because you're sitting with a polymorph, but you need a way to create a token, or the other way around. And you don't want to discard the piece you have in order to draw a fresh 7, because then you might just be in the same situation. It's much more beneficial to discard the pieces you don't need and hope to draw into those you need. Yeah. And Gaia's Blessing, I kind of misread this card. I thought that it could be used to shuffle your graveyard into your library, but that's only if it's put into your graveyard from your library. So this just didn't do what I thought it did, so it's not really worth it. Also, the same is the case with Firestorm. I thought that you could discard a bunch of cards and have this deal a bunch of damage, but you need as many targets as cards you discard. So discarding 40 cards lets you do 40 damage to 40 targets, but you must also have 40 targets available, and that's just not realistic. So yeah, and Lightning Storm is just bad. I kind of had it in the slides before because I thought it was funny, but the fun is over. I don't really like this card at all. Arachnogenesis is a fog effect that creates you a bunch of tokens, and this is only really relevant with our commander. And its fog effects are just not good in Commander, and this one is too expensive. A majority of cards we're playing is at sorcery speed. We want to be tapping out every turn. We don't want to be holding up 3 mana for someone that might attack us so that we can get a slight token payoff. So this is just not worth it. And Avenger of Zendikar is just not good as a polymorph payoff, because when you turbo into it with a polymorph spell on turn 3 or turn 4, it does create a lot of tokens because you don't have a lot of lands at this stage in the game. So it's just not very good in practice. Okay, so here's some new additions. And first of all, we're going to start off with some very good cards that I just completely missed out on. And as I discussed in the previous video, polymorph effects are very important, and we want to be running as many as we can. And here is 2 really good polymorph effects that aren't aren't really polymorph effects because you don't flip off your top of your library, but in practice they function the same way, and they, for example, natural order, you have to sacrifice a green creature, and then you can just find a green creature in your deck and put it onto the battlefield. And Colony Garden makes a green plant creature, and Dried Arbor is a green creature. So yeah, just an amazing card. And Defense of the Heart is so it's a 4-mana enchantment, and during your upkeep, if one of your opponents control 3 or more creatures, sacrifice Defense of the Heart, search your library for up to 2 creature cards, and put those creatures into play. And this is just really broken in a creature-heavy meta like mine, so I expect that there's going to be some player with 3 creatures, and if I'm holding some creature deck back from playing their creatures out, I'm severely stunting them in other ways. So, and of course, the payoff, when it goes off, you get 2 creatures, is insanely high value. And we're actually going to be talking about a card that can kind of force this card to resolve or to trigger later. And then I've gone a bit back on the non-worm worms, so so the big creatures that are not worms I've cut, and just to stay more on theme. And in place of them, I've put in some actual worms. So Impervious Great Worm is kind of cool because it's the 16/16, so it does what we need. It has a high power and a high toughness for our payoff spells, and to top it off, it has Indestructible. And this is actually kind of nice because apart from exile effects, we can be pretty sure that this survives a turn around the table. I mean, it's indestructible, so it's pretty hard to get rid of. And so when we polymorph into this, we can be pretty sure that when our turn comes around again, we can play our payoff spell. And in addition, in the late game, when we have a bunch of zombie creatures from Field of the Dead on the battlefield, hopefully, we can convoke this into play for only 3 mana. And so, yeah, it's actually pretty good. All the different abilities on it are relevant, and it has the right creature type. And then there's a Gotama All Devouring. And this one took me a bit of convincing, and it took me I had to put it into the deck and actually try to goldfish with it before I saw that it's actually pretty powerful. So first of all, this is actually a pretty castable creature. It only costs 5 mana compared to Impervious Great Worm and Wellspine Worm. So this is not actually that difficult to cast. And so you might think that the payoff of polymorphing into it isn't that huge either. But first of all, this actually has a kind of high power and toughness. Like 10 power it's not on the level of Impervious Great Worm or Wellspine Worm, but it's still a lot. It's still by far the most highest power creature worm, besides Impervious Great Worm and Wellspine Worm. And then it has this very unique effect that says other creatures have, when this creature attacks, you may have it fight Gotama All Devouring. And then when Gotama leaves the battlefield, each player draws cards equal to the amount of damage dealt by Gotama this turn by sources they control. So this means that unlike Impervious Great Worm, Gotama can absolutely be killed after we polymorph into it before we get our turn back, because all creatures our opponents control can choose to fight it when they attack. So if they have a total combined power of 8 and greater or greater, they can sacrifice their creatures, essentially because Gotama is going to kill any creature that they choose to have it fight with it. But in return, they get to draw upwards 8 or more cards. So this is kind of a bigger risk. But if it survives around the table, we can still play our pair spells. And another thing that I have actually had come up a bunch of time is that if we already have the Impervious Great Worm or the Wellspine Worm on the battlefield, and we perform an additional polymorph into Gotama All Devouring, then we can attack with our Impervious Great Worm or Worldspine Worm and choose to have it fight Gotama. And since Impervious Great Worm deals 16 damage to Gotama and Worldspine Worm deals 15 damage to Gotama, we can draw 15 to 16 cards off of that interaction. And that is actually very good, actually. So it, in a weird way, doubles up. It makes it so that if you already have an Impervious Great Worm or a Worldspine Worm on the battlefield, any polymorph spell you have, as long as you have a target for the polymorph, can essentially turn into a worm payoff spell. So we are running 11 polymorph effects now and 9 big card draw spells for the worms that require you to have a worm on the battlefield. And so Gotama can in some way make it so that we have 20 targets for a big draw spell if we have another worm on the battlefield. So that it's a very cool interaction, and yeah, it's actually pretty nice and very easily hard castable. Okay, I got a message. 2 seconds. Okay, so now on to some additions for acceleration. And this is might seem pretty boring to say, oh, I've included Cultivate and Kodama's Reach since they are major staples, but actually it's not so obvious that they are good in this deck. And actually I don't really include these cards in my green decks unless I absolutely have to. But what I found out is that between the basic forest and mountain and the basic snow-covered forest and snow-covered mountain, you can kind of use these cards to get some extra land names on the battlefield. And what I mean by this is that we need our kind of long-term goal in this deck is getting 7 lands with different names for Field of the Dead. And both Cultivate and Kodama's Reach essentially gives you 2 land names each. Now, it's not so good if you have too many of these basic land searches, because you can only do this kind of once, in the sense that once you get a forest, or maybe you can do it twice, but not a limited amount of times, because you only have 4 basic names to search for. So right now I'm only playing a Cultivate. I'm not playing Kodama's Reach, but that could change. And in the same way, there's Search for Tomorrow. This does not give you a basic land on your hand, but it does have the additional benefit that if you suspend it on turn 1, it will come down to turn 3 and let you polymorph a turn earlier, since the polymorph spells usually cost 4 mana. So I'm still not sure in which configuration these are good, but I guess the main takeaway is that basic land searchers, basic land ramp, is not so bad again. Since we're playing the snow-covered versions. So yeah. And then there's I've been convinced by myself to try out Mirror's Guile, and it has actually paid off a bit. And this one is a bit hard to evaluate. So it's a 1 mana enchantment, and during your upkeep, you may look at the top 3 cards of your library and put them back in any order. So this essentially, it's a pretty abstract to evaluate it, but in the sense, if you want to compare this to a sorcery or instant card draw spell, it essentially lets you look 2 cards deeper. So the first card you were gonna draw no matter what, but the second and the third card from the top of your library, you don't get to draw before your next turn and your second turn. But Mirror's Guile lets you kind of get to draw the card that you were gonna draw 2 turns from now on this turn, except on the turn 2 turns from now. And that is essentially letting you dig 2 cards deeper into your deck. If you don't care about the quantity of cards you're getting, which this card essentially doesn't draw you any extra cards, But if you just care about what the card you draw is, and in our case, we kind of do, we really want to dig for that polymorph spell or that token maker spell in those early turns. And this card lets us do that at a very efficient rate. Compare this to Fateless Looting, which also digs you 2 cards deeper. It also doesn't draw you any extra cards because you have to discard 2, but it digs you 2 cards deeper in your deck, and therefore it is kind of, Mirror's Guile is kind of equally good as a sort of dig, archaeological dig to find that polymorph spell. And in addition, we are running a ton of fetch lands in this deck because we're using them to fetch for our token makers, our Dryad Arbor and our Dwarven Mind. And with a fetch land, this card gets reset in value. So each time you fetch, this card will dig you 2 cards deep and 1 additional time. So the first time it digs you 2 cards deep. If we don't find the polymorph spell, we can play our fetch land, shuffle, and the next turn we get to look 2 cards deep again. So I do actually think that this card is very powerful for finding that polymorph spell. And some newer utility lands. Obviously, Boseiju from the new Kamigawa set looks ridiculous. The cost of including this is almost none because we don't really care about the forest subtype at all. We don't have a lot of cards that care about it at all. So we don't mind not playing many forests, quote unquote forests, cards who have the forest type in our deck. And this comes in untapped, and we can pay 2 and discard it to destroy an artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land, and our opponent gets to search for a basic land card, but really doesn't matter Latin Commander, and this is just a very nice land hate artifact removal, enchantment removal for almost no cost. And then there's Kessig Wolfrun. Now, initially, I thought that Rogue's Passage and Skark the Rage Pit were better than Kessig Wolfrun because I couldn't really see any situation in which we wanted to dump a bunch of mana into Kessig Wolfrun. But even in the situations that we never really do it, it still costs the same as Skark the Rage Pit. It still gives the creature a trample. And the only thing that we are missing is a +1/+1 from Skark the Rage Pit. And if we have a 15/15, a 16/16 worm, maybe our commander, which can grow really large, we don't care about the extra +1/+1. But in the situations where we have a token, giving it, dumping all our mana into a token to give it +10, and trample can be dangerous for our opponent. So I do think that this Kessig Wolfrun has more applications over Rogue's Passage and Skark the Rage Pit. So that is going in that slot now. And then the Scavenger Ground, I just completely missed this before. This is Graveyard Hate, which is pretty nice. And it's on a land, so we can use our land tutors to get it. I think that playing Scavenger Grounds is better than dedicating a sorcery or instant for a Graveyard Hate. So, yeah. And then there's Zoidic Cavern, and this one is interesting, and I'm actually not super convinced yet that this is an include, but it's essentially a colorless land that you can play as a creature face down for 3 mana as a 2/2 creature. And then you can also turn it up for 2 colorless, but you're probably never going to do that. The use case for this is that you can play it on turn 3 as a 2/2 creature if you don't have a way to generate a token. And then the next turn you could use it as a polymorph target. And it's just a land, so if you have already a way of creating a token, you can just play this as a colorless land. The cost is very low. The opportunity cost is very low. But in the games where you don't have a way to generate a polymorph target, this can be that polymorph target. Granted, 3 mana is a lot, but it is cheaper than most of the polymorph spells, so it will come down. It kind of fits the curve So I think that this might be worth it. Lassie does turn Timber Symbiosis, and this is also a card I'm not really sure it's worth it, but it is on the backside an untapped land that taps for green if you pay 3 life. And so since we are not caring about having a lot of basic forest or in our deck, this can actually be pretty nice because it's an additional unique name for our Field of the Dead. And in the case that we are feeling lucky, we want to pay 7 mana, maybe we don't have a lot to do, and we want to see if there's a whim in our top 7. We could do that, and it will put it on the battlefield. So, and we'll get into a card that I have been considering that will work great with this, but I just think that the opportunity cost is very low, and we're kind of looking for a lot of unique land names in the first place, so this might be pretty good. And okay, so now I'm just gonna check that I'm still recording. Okay, I am. So now we're gonna talk about the kind of big upgrade to the deck. And so if you remember in the beginning, I said that this deck can draw a ton of cards, but it's pretty hard to capitalize off all these cards in your hand. And that's where Hypergenesis come in. Now, Hypergenesis is a suspend spell, and it's basically Shurika, if you know that. It's like that Shurika is an ancient sorcery, and it says, starting with you, each player may put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card from their hand onto the battlefield. Repeat this process until no one puts a card onto the battlefield. Now, just a rules clarification, even if one person decides I'm done or I don't have any more things I can put onto the battlefield, you still get to put a card onto the battlefield until you can't anymore or you choose to stop. So none of the other players can sort of hose you in this way and kind of stop it before you wanted to. I originally thought that this card would not be good in this deck because we don't only run 3 creatures. So, I mean, the chance of having Hypergenesis and a creature is very low. But we do have a lot of enchantments and we do have a lot of lands. And so if we draw a bunch of cards, like 20 cards, which is not unrealistic in this deck, we can use Hypergenesis to sort of dump all the permanents we have in our hand on the field, and maybe in worst case just ramp a bunch, but maybe in best case we can play a ton of high value enchantments, a ton of lands, maybe even some creatures. And yeah, doing gold fishing, this has just overperformed. I was trying it out and I was kind of skeptical, but it seems good every time I play it. And so how do we actually play it? Well, we need spells that cheat out instants and sorceries. And Electro Dominance is one of these. It deals X damage, and you can cast a card with converted mana cost X or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. Hypergenesis converted mana cost is 0, so this is just 2 red to play Hypergenesis. And it also doubles as a removal spell and a way to cast a lot of our sorceries at instant speed, and it has a lot of other additional utility besides just playing Hypergenesis. And Invoke Calamity is a new card, and it says you may cast up to 2 instants or sorcery with total mana value 6 less from your graveyard and or your hand without paying their mana cost. If those spells would be put into your graveyard, exile them instead and exile Invoke Calamity. So this has the nice effect that it can let you play Hypergenesis from your hand along with some other spell. And it can also let you play Hypergenesis from your graveyard if you were to, say, draw a bunch of cards and go to this card because you didn't really hit any combos. You can just throw Hypergenesis in the graveyard, and later, when you draw Evoke Calamity, you can still do the combo. And Mystic's Mastery is a card that was already in the deck, but I was a bit unsure about it then, but now I'm very sure about it. It exiles a card that's an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, and then you copy it and cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So this is a way of playing Hypergenesis from your graveyard it also lets you play a bunch of, like, Invoke Calamity, it lets you play a bunch of other spells from your graveyard. And its Overload is a total blowout. So, yeah, between these three cards, which may seem like hard to get Hypergenesis, one of these three cards in your hand, and it is, but if you draw 20, you have a pretty good likelihood of being able to do it. So, and the worst case scenario is just discarding Hypergenesis, or even suspending it if you're feeling frisky. Okay, so lastly, I have a bunch of cards that I'm trying out, and I think they're good. First of all, Court of Bounty. Now, I was pretty unsure about this in the beginning, but it works pretty well in playtesting, and the more I think about it, the better it seems. It's a 4-mana enchantment and comes down, you become the monarch. So it comes down and gets you another card, and that isn't the worst in the world. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you're the monarch, instead, you may put a creature or land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, in the worst case scenario, this card comes down as a 4-mana enchantment and draws you a card. And then when it gets to your next turn, it lets you play a land from your hand onto the battlefield. So it ramps you, basically. And this effect of playing extra lands is not something we have a lot of in the deck. So we can be fairly sure that this will be valuable when we have it. Now, obviously not worth 4 mana, but still. And then there's the huge upside in that if we're sitting with one of our worms in our hand and none of our opponent takes the monarch from us. Now remember, we are a token deck, so it's not impossible that we can create some sort of protection. And this just becomes a crazy, crazy card. And so I do feel like the floor is not that low, and the ceiling is ridiculously high on this card. And also it introduces the monarch mechanic, which I think is really fun. Now, next up is a new card again. It's the Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and it's a saga. Step 1 creates a 2/2 red Goblin Shaman creature token with whenever this creature attacks, create a treasure token. This is a target for our polymorph spells, and it also ramps us if we choose to attack with it. It creates a treasure token. So, not the worst effect. Next up, it says you may discard up to 2 cards, and if you do, draw that many cards. And this is another effect that we're looking for. We want to discard cards from our hand that we don't need and dig for a polymorph effect. And it's kind of nice in the way that this card creates a token that lets you ramp, and then in the next turn, it digs you to find that polymorph spell for that token that you have just created. So this is just a lot of nice synergy in these two first chapters. And then on the third chapter, it says exile the saga and return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. And then we get Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. Now this card is basically Kiki-Jiki, but it doesn't have haste, so it becomes a 2/2 enchantment creature Goblin Shaman. And this is another polymorph target. So if our first token from chapter 1 dies, or maybe we did use it for a polymorph spell, but we are sitting with another polymorph spell in our hand, well, this saga will flip into a new creature that we can choose as target for the polymorph spell. Now, in another case where we do actually have a big target on the field, this card says pay 1 and tap it to create a token that's a copy of another target non-legendary creature you control, except it gains haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the end step. Now, if you remember, I did cut the Flame Shadow Conjuring and the Molten Echoes, but this is so free, and this is a similar effect. It's slightly better in the way that we don't have to do it when our worm enters the battlefield. We don't. We can kind of do it later. So there's not a lot of timing restrictions. And then it also gets sacrificed at the end step instead of exiled. So in the case of Wellspine Worm, the token will create 3 5/5 worm tokens with trample. And so this is kind of just a ridiculously better Molten Echoes. It's a Molten Echoes that it has 2 polymorph targets, tokens that we can use as polymorph targets. It's a Molten Echoes that lets you ramp in the form of treasure tokens. It's a Molten Echo that lets you rummage for a polymorph spell, and it's a Molten Echoes that costs 1 less. So even though I don't want to play Molten Echoes in my deck, this card just has ridiculously amount of synergy in the deck. And yeah, I just think that it's pretty good. I can't imagine this card playing out bad in any game, honestly. Lastly, there's Pandemonium, and this is kind of like Warstorm Surge in the way that whenever a creature comes into play, that creature's controller may have it deal damage equal to its power to target creature or player of his or her choice. But this is for all players, so it's kind of chaotic. But the idea is that we at one can take a lot of advantage of it. With our 15/15 worms entering the battlefield, with our 5/5 worm tokens, with our commander. This is the way we want to be doing these effects. I was talking about Fling, Thud, Soul's Fire, and stuff like that in the beginning that lets you take the power of one of our high power creatures and turn it into damage. Well, this is the way to do it because it doesn't make us sacrifice the creature, and it just sits there and it's recurring, so it's really threatening. Okay, so as the last thing, I want to talk about these kind of meme cards. So let's start with Tempting Worm. So this is a worm, which is very important. And when it comes into play, each opponent may put any number of artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and all lands from his or her hand into play. And it's a 5/5 worm for 2 mana. Now, is this a good card? No. But does this card create a kind of Russian roulette feeling when you're polymorphing? Heck yeah, it does. Because if you polymorph into this, you get ultra punished. And so I was just kind of playtesting, goldfishing, and I was kind of feeling like, only 3 worms in the deck. Each time you polymorph, you have to sit there, flip a bunch of cards, sometimes even up to 50 cards of your deck before you hit one of these worms. And it's kind of boring, right? Because you're going to hit a really big worm. And everybody else at the table knows that too. So what about throwing in a huge, huge, huge risk? So that really turns out the excitement when you're polymorphing. So obviously this does not make the deck stronger, but I think it will add some kind of fun value to the table. Then there's Endless Swarms, and boy, this card is exciting. It's 8 mana for a Sultry, and you put a 1/1 green snake creature into play for each card in your hand. Now it has Epic, so for the rest of the game, you can't play spells. Yeah, so when you cast this, you're done playing spells for the rest of the game. But at the beginning of each upkeep, you copy this spell, except its Epic ability. So you get an Endless Swarm copy each upkeep. And it says put a 1/1 green snake creature token into play for each card in your hand. Now remember that this deck can get quite a large hand size. And so imagine drawing a bunch of cards. Maybe you have a 30 card hand size. And you're thinking, well, 31 snakes each turn for the rest of the game doesn't sound that bad, especially when you have Kazakh Bullfront as a mana sink to use your lands on. And so I think that this actually can be pretty exciting, and it is kind of an endless swarm, and I'd like to see how powerful this is, because 31 snakes every turn doesn't sound too bad. So yeah, a really fun card. I am really excited to try it out. Now, some other considerations. Now, I'm not quite sold on these, or some of them I am sold on, but I just wanted to showcase them because they might be included in the deck in a further update. Cryptolith Rites just let your creatures tap for mana. This is probably very good with Field of the Dead, but I haven't really been able, when I goldfish, to really get that far into the game, into the late game, where I have a ton of zombie tokens and I want a bunch of mana. Usually in the games, I have a couple of tokens and I need them as polymorph targets, so I can see it's pretty consistent to get a token onto the battlefield. And I can see Cryptolith Rites letting that token be able to tap for mana is kind of valuable. But I'm not really sure. This seems like a very late game payoff. Like you have a super wide board and you can generate a ton of mana. I don't know. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's not. I think it's good, but I need to play a bit more with the deck to see it. And then there's Sylvan Library. Now this is just a strictly better Mirror's Guile. And the only reason this isn't in the deck because it's expensive and I don't have the money for it. But yeah, totally throw this card into deck. It's good for the same reason that Mirror's Guile is good, but then it's even better. So, you know. Then there's an Explumagian and Cultivator Colossus. I just wanted to show these. These are not worms, but they're really, really, really valuable payoffs. So if you want to go a bit more tryhard with this deck and maybe not restrict yourself to only worms, then, you know, these cards are crazy. And then there's Renin 7. And Renin 7 is a Planeswalker, and it's kind of expensive, but it does a lot that this card wants. First of all, it gives you a bunch of, with its +1, it gives you a bunch of lands. And then most importantly, its 0 ability lets you put any number of lands from your hand into the battlefield tab. Now, this is kind of like a mana bond. Remember the 1 mana green enchantment? This does the same thing, except it doesn't require you to discard the rest of your hand. So if you draw if you have one of these big hands, like 15, 20 cards, and you have the mana to slam this down, you can just ramp a ton with its 0 ability. And then, you know, its -3 creates a token that can be pretty large. So even though at turn 5 it's kind of late and you want to have your token already on the board for the polymorph, this token is still pretty large. And then his ultimate is pretty good. Lets you return all permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand, and you have no maximum hand size. Both two very relevant abilities, and it's not very unrealistic to ultimate these Planeswalkers since we are running Doubling Season in the deck. Okay, so Concordant Crossroads. I just think this card is pretty good in the deck. 1 mana gives all creatures haste, great with our commander, great with all our worms, great with all our tokens. Yeah, I just think this is pretty good. I just don't have the money for it, so that's why. Then there's Forbidden Orchard. Now this is a land that has for any color, and this is pretty nice for our Field of the Dead since we need a lot of unique land names. But whenever you tap it, you have to give your opponent a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. Now this is good with Defense of the Heart that we talked about earlier. So if somebody don't want to play creatures so that your Defense of the Heart triggers, you can just force them to do it by giving them creatures. This is actually pretty a powerful interaction. It also works great with Oath of Druid. So you can give your opponent creatures so they are not... So maybe there is no one who has... Maybe everyone has 2 creatures on the field, and it's this one player's turn where he only has 1 creature on the field, and Oath of Druid triggers, and you can tap this in response, give him another one. Now there's no opponent that has more creatures than him, and so he won't get a Oath of Druid creature. Next there's Moldgraph Monstrosity, and this is a trample 8/8. Pretty nice to polymorph into, but when it dies, you can exile it and return 2 creature cards at random from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, it has to be 2. So you need 2 creature cards in the graveyard, which is pretty hard with how few creatures we are running. But my god, if you have 2 creature cards in your graveyard, an Impervious Great Worm, and maybe Kutama, this card will just blow. It is so high value, but I do think that it's pretty hard to guarantee. So yeah, I don't know. Then Ancient Grudge, I just wanted to include it quickly. It's pretty nice artifact removal, and since we are having all these big hands with 15 cards in them, and sometimes we don't have the Reliquary Tower, and we need to go to discard, and we need to discard a bunch of cards, and we need to make some priorities. Well, Ancient Grudge is an easy discard because we can just play it from our hand for even cheaper. than its normal casting cost. So this is just synergizes nicely with our deck. And if you need an artifact removal, I think this one is one of the best. And then lastly, Worldly Tutor, a card I'm really considering playing, but I'm not quite sure. So first of all, the main reason to play this card is that it can get the Dryad Arbor out of the deck. So if we're setting up a polymorph and we need that creature on the field as a polymorph target, we can get our Dryad Arbor and then we can play it. So this can get the Dryad Arbor out of our deck for a polymorph, or it can give us the token or the polymorph target we need in the form of Dryad Arbor. Now the downside is that if we have drawn the Dryad Arbor, this card only targets our big worms. And in that case, its use cases are pretty few, in the way that we can kind of use it to ensure that we hit the right worm. So if we're in a scenario where we like, oh, I need Impervious Great Worm right now, or I need Kotama right now, we can say, oh, I'll put that card on top of the library before I polymorph, so I'm guaranteed to hit that. How much value that has, I don't really know, honestly. And I'm kind of looking for more reasons to play this Worldly Tutor, because I do think that the use case of getting Dryad Arbor out of the library or getting Dryad Arbor onto your hand is pretty high. But I do also feel like I need one more good reason to play this card, really. I need something else. And it does function with Turn Timber Symbiosis in the way that you can put Worm on top of your library and then you can play Turn Timber Symbiosis. You're guaranteed to hit one creature in your top 7. And that's pretty nice, but that's 8 mana and it's very late combo. So I don't know. Yeah, but this was the update of the deck. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you guys next time.